The desert wind carried death on its breath as twilight painted the canyon walls crimson. High above the settlement of Willow Springs, where ancient Apache hunting trails carved through red sandstone, a small cook fire flickered against the gathering darkness like a prayer to forgotten gods. Dasan knelt beside the flames, his weathered hands steady as he stirred cornmeal into heated water. At 35, the Chiricahua Apache bore the scars of two worlds, the traditional marks of his people, and the harder lines carved by 20 years as an army scout. His buckskin shirt darkened by desert sun and old sweat stretched across shoulders that had carried wounded soldiers through hostile territory. A single eagle feather bound with sinew according to the old ways hung from hair black as a starless night. The wooden spoon moved in careful circles, each motion deliberate. As he stirred, memories crept unbidden into his thoughts, images of his sister Naadaji, whose name meant corn pollen blessing. Sitting by just such a fire in the old days, before the reservations, before the fever took her. She had been Clara's age when the soldiers first came to their mountain stronghold, her eyes bright with the same stubborn courage he now saw in this Swedish child. The irony was not lost on him, an Apache warrior protecting a white man's daughter in a land where his own people were viewed as the enemy. His old leg wound throbbed with each shift of position, a constant reminder of the fall that had ended his military career. The break had never healed properly, leaving him with a limp that grew more pronounced in cold weather or when fatigue set in. But pain was an old companion now, as familiar as the weight of his rifle, or the sound of desert wind through canyon walls. He had learned to work around it, to let it inform his decisions without controlling them. Tonight it whispered that the coming days would test every limit he possessed. Across the fire, wrapped in a threadbare gray blanket that seemed to swallow her small frame, sat Clara Eriksson. 11 years old, with hair the color of winter wheat and eyes blue as mountain sky. She clutched a leather satchel against her chest as if it contained her very soul. 3 days had passed since her world ended in gunfire and betrayal. Yet something in her bearing spoke of strength that went deeper than her frontier upbringing. There was a quality to her silence, a dignity in her grief, that reminded Dasan of his grandmother's stories about the old nobility, the way certain bloodlines carried themselves through tragedy. "Please eat," Dasan said his English, carrying the precise cadence of someone who had learned the language as a tool of survival rather than birth. He lifted the spoon, steam rising from the simple porridge. "Warm your belly first." Clara's fingers trembled as she accepted the wooden implement. Where their skin touched his calloused palm, steadying the spoon handle, something passed between them. Trust, perhaps, or the desperate recognition that in this harsh land, the only currency that mattered was the willingness to stand between danger and those too small to face it alone. In that moment, Dasan felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever responsibility settled on his shoulders. It was the same feeling he'd had the first time he'd guided a cavalry patrol through Apache territory, knowing that every decision could mean the difference between life and death for the men following him. The child took her first careful bite, and Dasan's attention never wavered from the shadows beyond their circle of light. 20 years of reading Apache sign and white man's treachery had taught him to trust the voice that whispered warnings in the desert wind. His ears caught the subtle wrongness in the night sounds, the absence of cricket song, in the way the coyotes had fallen silent in the distance. These were signs his Apache grandfathers had taught him to read lessons learned in childhood that no amount of military training could improve upon. Tonight, that ancient wisdom spoke of death approaching on shod hooves. The distant sound came gradually, leather creaking metal jingling against metal, the careful placement of horses' feet on stone. Then the unmistakable snick of a rifle bolt being worked, the sound sharp as a rattlesnake's warning in the cooling air. Dasan's muscles tensed involuntarily, his body responding to 20 years of conditioning before his mind could process the threat. Without conscious thought, He positioned his body between Clara and the rim rocks above. His Spencer carbine, loaded and ready, lay within easy reach. The movement was fluid, practiced the gesture of a man who had made such calculations 1,000 times in Apache country. In his mind, he was already running through possibilities, angles of fire, available cover escape routes through terrain he had memorized during their approach. "Stay small," he murmured, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. But his dark eyes held the focused intensity of a hunting hawk, and Clara caught the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of mortal danger. "Keep eating. No sudden moves." Clara's small hand found his wrist, her fingers barely encircling the thick muscle there. The touch lasted only a moment, but in that brief contact, something was sealed between them. A covenant written not in words, but in the ancient language of protection offered and accepted. For Dasan, it was a moment of profound recognition. This child needed him not as a scout or soldier, but as family. The realization both terrified and strengthened him, awakening protective instincts that transcended tribal loyalty or military duty. The fire's embers danced upward into the darkening sky, each spark a small defiance against the coming night. Then the first rifle shot split the desert silence like thunder. The bullet struck the canyon wall 6 inches above Clara's head, showering them with stone chips and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The porridge pot rang like a mission bell as lead grazed its rim, spilling precious food into the sand. Clara's scream caught in her throat as Dasan swept her behind a weathered boulder, his body a living wall between her and the shooters above. Orange muzzle flashes strobed from 3 positions along the rim rock, the reports echoing off canyon walls in a rolling crescendo of violence. Professional work positioned to create a killing field with no escape except through the guns themselves. Dasan's military training kicked in automatically, his mind cataloging the attackers' positions and calculating fields of fire, even as his hands moved to return their deadly greeting. Dasan's Spencer answered with measured precision, each shot calculated to conserve ammunition, while making the attackers think twice about exposing themselves. The .52 caliber bullets sparked off stone and whined into the night, but he was shooting at shadows and muzzle flashes, not men. In his mind, he could hear Sergeant Martinez from his first patrol. "Save your bullets, Red Hawk. Every shot counts when you're outnumbered." "Count your shots," he whispered to Clara, though she could barely hear him over the thunder of gunfire. "When the shooting stops, they'll come down. That's when we move." 4 days earlier, Henry Erickson had been the happiest man in Arizona territory. The Swedish immigrant guided his freight wagon along the rutted trail that connected the mining camps to civilization, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that came from a lifetime of hard work finally paying off. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but Henry barely noticed the heat. Today was the day his dreams would finally come true. Beside him sat his daughter Clara, her blue bonnet providing scant protection against the glare, her small hands gripping the wagon's side as it lurched over stones and gullies. She was humming a Swedish lullaby her mother had taught her, Trollmor's Vagsång, the melody drifting sweetly through the harsh desert air. "Flicka min," Henry said softly in Swedish, his voice carrying the musical cadence of his homeland. "Soon we'll be in Willow Springs, and you can rest properly. Miss Morrison will have prepared a fine meal for us, and then—" He paused, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Then we'll have the most important dinner of our lives." Clara looked up at him curiously. "Important, how, Papa?" Henry's grin widened. "Tonight we celebrate with Uncle Silas. 3 years of partnership, 3 years of believing in each other when everyone else thought we were fools. Tonight we show him the papers that make him a full partner in the richest silver claim in Arizona territory." The thought of Silas Hartwell's reaction filled Henry with warm anticipation. His oldest friend had been like a brother for 5 years now, ever since they'd met in a Tucson saloon, and discovered they shared the same impossible dream, striking it rich in the unforgiving desert. Silas had stood by him through every disappointment, every failed prospect, every moment when giving up seemed like the only sensible choice. The leather satchel at Clara's feet contained more than just their future. It held the culmination of a friendship, tested by hardship and strengthened by shared hope. The properly filed mining deed for the Quicksilver claim was there, complete with county seal and surveyor's marks. But more importantly, folded carefully beneath it, were the partnership papers Henry had spent 3 months preparing with lawyers in Tucson. 50-50 ownership, just as they'd agreed that first night over whiskey and wild dreams. Hidden within the satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a small tin locket that had belonged to Anna Lindqvist before she became Anna Eriksson. Henry had never told Clara about her mother's aristocratic heritage. The engraved coat of arms on the locket's inner lid spoke of Swedish nobility, of castles and titles that seemed like fairy tales in this harsh frontier world. But tonight, flushed with success and surrounded by friends, perhaps it was time to share that secret as well. In his mind, Henry could already see Silas's face when he revealed the partnership papers. The surprise, the joy, the relief that their years of struggle had finally paid off for both of them. They would drink toasts to friendship and fortune, make plans for the future, maybe even discuss bringing their families west from Sweden and Missouri. It would be perfect. The wagon's destination was Willow Springs, where Henry planned to meet with Beatrice Morrison, and the schoolteacher who had agreed to serve as Clara's guardian should anything happen to him. But that was just a precaution, a legal formality. Tonight was about celebration, about sharing their good fortune with the friend who had made it all possible. Their route took them through Dead Man's Draw, where Henry expected to find Silas waiting with a bottle of champagne and that crooked grin that had gotten them both into more trouble and adventure than any two sensible men deserved. Instead, he found Betrayal wearing war paint and wielding rifles. The attack came without warning as their wagon rounded a bend between 2 red mesas. 5 riders wearing stolen Apache clothing and carrying military-issue weapons emerged from concealment among the greasewood and Palo Verde. They whooped and screamed in a grotesque parody of Apache raiders, their faces painted with ochre and ash by men who had never seen a real war party. But it was the leader's voice that turned Henry's blood to ice. Conrad Blackjack Morrison wore an Apache headdress over his deputy's badge, his pale eyes holding no mercy as he leveled his rifle at the wagon. Henry had expected Silas to be waiting with celebration and friendship. Instead, he found his friend's business partner turned executioner. "Silas!" Henry called out desperately, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Silas, what is this madness? What are you doing?" Then he saw him. Silas Hartwell sat his horse at the back of the group, his face streaked with war paint, but his eyes unmistakable. The man who had been Henry's closest friend, who had shared his dreams and struggles, who had helped raise Clara from a baby. That man raised his rifle with hands that shook not from fear, but from the weight of betrayal and wounded pride. For Silas, this moment had been 3 months in the making. 3 months of gnawing suspicion and growing resentment as he watched Henry make trip after trip to Tucson, always with excuses about legal matters and paperwork. 3 months of imagining himself being pushed out of the partnership, relegated to hired help after years of equal partnership. The successful assay reports had been the final straw, $20,000 in silver ore, and Henry had filed the claim in his name alone. In Silas's mind, the betrayal was already complete. Henry was just another greedy prospector who had used him for his expertise and connections, then cast him aside when success finally arrived. The friendship, the years of shared hardship, the promises of equal partnership, all lies designed to keep him working, while Henry laid the groundwork for his own fortune. The truth was different. But Silas had stopped listening to truth months ago. Suspicion and wounded pride had poisoned his thoughts, turning every innocent action into evidence of deception, every legal precaution into proof of betrayal. The partnership papers in Henry's satchel, the very documents that would have made him wealthy beyond his dreams, had become just another weapon in his friend's arsenal of deceit. "I'm sorry, Henry." Silas said, his voice cracking with emotion, even as his finger found the trigger. "I'm truly sorry. But I found that ore first. I've been working these claims for 5 years while you stumbled around playing prospector. The silver is mine by right, and I won't let you steal it from me." Henry's hand moved toward his old army Colt, but Clara's terrified scream froze him in place. She was staring not at the painted raiders, but at something that had fallen from Silas's saddle, a carved bone knife handle that she recognized instantly. It was the hunting knife Henry had crafted as a Christmas gift 2 years ago, etched with Silas's initials and a small heart to represent their friendship. "Uncle Silas." Clara's voice was small and confused, using the title of affection she had always reserved for her father's dearest friend. In her mind, she could see him last Christmas morning, tears in his eyes, as he'd examined the knife Henry had carved for him. He'd swept her up in a bear hug, spinning her around, while declaring it the finest gift he'd ever received. The same man now sat before them with paint on his face and murder in his eyes. "Why are you dressed like that? Why do you have Papa's gun?" The questions tumbled from her lips, each one a knife thrust of innocence that cut through the war paint and pretense to the heart of the man she'd loved like an uncle. For a moment, Silas's face crumbled with something that might have been shame. The sight of Clara's trusting confusion, the memory of all the evenings he'd spent bouncing her on his knee and telling her stories, the weight of what he was about to do it all, crashed together in a moment of devastating clarity. "I never meant for you to see this little one," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Your papa was a good man, but he was going to take what's rightfully mine. I can't let that happen." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth, even as he spoke them. But he'd come too far to turn back now, invested too much in his narrative of betrayal, to acknowledge the possibility of his own error. In his poisoned mind, Henry's secrecy about the legal preparations had been proof of deception rather than evidence of a loving friend preparing a surprise. Henry fought back with the desperation of a father protecting his child, his revolver barking defiance, until the cylinder clicked empty. His military training from the Civil War came flooding back. Duck roll return, fire, keep moving. But 5 against 1 were impossible odds, even for a man fighting for everything he loved. As the false Apache closed in for the kill, Henry made his final act of love. He pressed the leather satchel into Clara's trembling hands and pushed her from the wagon into the concealment of a thick greasewood bush. "Hide him in Kara," he gasped in Swedish blood darkening his shirt where Conrad's bullet had found its mark. His strength was fading fast, but his love for his daughter burned brighter than ever. "Find the schoolteacher, Beatrice Morrison in Willow Springs. Show her what's in the locket, she'll understand." His voice was growing weaker, but his eyes remained fierce with paternal love. "Remember who you are, where your mother came from. The old country, the Lindqvist name. You are nobility, Clara. Never forget that." Clara watched from her hiding place as her father died with her name on his lips, while the man she had called Uncle Silas stood over his body with tears streaming down his painted cheeks. The image would haunt her dreams for months to come. The collision between love and betrayal. between the uncle who had carried her to bed when she fell asleep by the fire, and the stranger who had murdered her father for silver and suspicion. She remained motionless among the thorns until full darkness, too terrified to move, clutching the satchel that contained their last hope for justice. In the distance, she could hear Conrad's men searching for her, calling out with false concern about a poor, lost child who needed their protection. But some instinct deeper than fear kept her frozen in place, hidden among the thorns, while her world burned down around her. It was near midnight when Dasan found her. The former army scout had been following a different trail entirely when he heard the distant gunshots and saw the circling buzzards. 20 years of experience had taught him to read the signs of violence in this harsh land, and everything about this scene spoke of careful deception rather than random Apache raid. His examination of the ambush site told him everything he needed to know about the attackers. The cartridge cases scattered in the sand were .45-70 government issue, not the mixed calibers typical of Apache raiders. The boot prints showed military-style boots, not moccasins. Most telling of all, someone had been careless enough to drop the carved knife white man's craftsmanship, not Apache work. The war paint on nearby rocks was applied with fingers, rather than the traditional brushes his people used, the patterns meaningless to anyone who understood true Apache symbols. "Inde bik ego," he murmured in Apache, studying the false sign. "White man's lies wearing my people's faces." As he knelt beside Henry's body, Dasan felt a familiar tightness in his chest. This was not the first good man he'd seen murdered by greed, and deception would not be the last, unless something changed in this territory. The sight of Henry's face, peaceful in death, despite the violence of his end, reminded him of other friends lost to frontier justice men who tried to do right in a land where right and wrong often blurred together like mirages in the desert heat. The old wound in his leg throbbed as he rose to search for survivors, a constant reminder of his own brush with mortality. 6 months ago, a horse fall during a routine patrol had shattered the bone and ended his military career. The break had never healed properly, leaving him with a permanent limp and chronic pain that worsened with weather changes or prolonged activity. But pain was a luxury he couldn't afford when there might be lives at stake. He found Clara by following the scuff marks where she had crawled deeper into the brush. She didn't scream when his shadow fell across her hiding place, though her eyes went wide with the particular terror of a child who had seen too much death in too short a time. In her gaze, he saw the same haunted quality that had marked his sister's eyes in the months before the fever took her. "I am Dasan," he said in careful English, his hands visible and empty. "My name means leader, in the tongue of my people. I will not harm you, little one." Something in his steady gaze convinced Clara to trust. She told him her name in a voice hoarse from thirst, and terror showed him the satchel her father had died protecting, and repeated Henry's final instructions about finding the schoolteacher in Willow Springs. As she spoke, Dasan found himself thinking of Nadaji again. How she would have been just this age now, how she might have looked at him with the same mixture of fear and desperate hope. The thought brought both pain and purpose. He could not save his sister from the fever that had claimed so many on the reservation, but he could protect this child from the human predators who stalked the frontier. It was a debt owed not just to Henry Erickson's memory, but to all the innocents caught in the grinding machinery of territorial greed. The journey to Willow Springs took them through country controlled by cattle barons and mining interests past ranches, where Apache were viewed with suspicion and settlers with barely concealed contempt. But Dasan had given his word, and among the Chiricahua, a warrior's oath was more binding than iron chains. The promise carried weight that went beyond mere duty. It was a sacred trust that connected him to the moral framework his grandfather had taught him in childhood. As they rode through the star-filled night, Clara walking beside his limping horse to spare the animal's strength, Dasan found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. 20 years as an army scout, serving men who often viewed him as a useful savage rather than a trusted ally. 20 years of walking the line between his Apache heritage and the white world's demands, never fully belonging to either. The leg wound that had ended his military service might have been a blessing in disguise. It had freed him from a life of divided loyalties, given him the chance to choose his own path, rather than follow orders from men who would never truly understand him. Tonight, with Clara's trust resting on his shoulders, that choice felt more important than any decision he'd made in uniform. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked during one of their brief rest stops, her voice carrying the directness of childhood. Dasan considered the question carefully before answering. "Walking in beauty," he said in Apache, then translated, "Walking in beauty means protecting those who cannot protect themselves. It is not about blood or tribe, it is about what makes us human." In his mind, he could hear his grandmother's voice teaching him the old stories, the ones about warriors who transcended tribal boundaries to serve something greater than themselves. Those teachings had sustained him through 20 years of military service, through the deaths of friends and the betrayal of trust, through the long nights when he wondered if he was fighting for the right side in an endless war. Now, with Clara's small hand trustingly placed in his, those teachings felt more relevant than ever. The first pale light of dawn was touching the eastern peaks when the riders found them at San Pedro River crossing. 3 gunmen emerged from a stand of cottonwoods as they approached the ford, their horses positioned to block any retreat. The leader was a lean man with graying whiskers and the cold eyes of a professional killer. "That's her," the man called to his companions, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Swedish Henry's brat, sure enough." Dasan Spencer answered before the man could finish his threat, the big .52 caliber bullet taking the closest gunman's center mass and toppling him from his saddle. The familiar weight of the rifle in his hands brought back 20 years of muscle memory. Sight, picture, breath control, smooth trigger pull. War was an ugly business, but he had always been good at it. "Get down," Dasan commanded, sliding from his horse and pulling Clara with him. The riverbank offered little cover, but the snake ran deep and fast, swollen with spring floods that would challenge even a strong swimmer. Dasan's mind raced through tactical possibilities: stay and fight with limited ammunition, or risk the crossing and hope their pursuers couldn't follow. The decision was made easier by Clara's presence. Her safety mattered more than his own survival. Dasan snatched Clara up in his arms and plunged into the icy torrent, feeling the current immediately seize them and drag them downstream. The shock of cold water drove the breath from his lungs, and his old leg injury screamed in protest as he fought to maintain their position in the flow. Every step sent daggers of pain through his shattered bones, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. "I can't breathe." Clara gasped, water streaming from her hair as a wave crashed over them. Dasan said in Apache, the word meaning "my little one," carrying all the protection he could offer. His voice was steady despite the pain and cold, drawing on reserves of strength he had developed during his hardest military campaigns. "Hold tight. The water spirits will carry us to safety." In his mind, he was already calculating the downstream terrain, remembering patrol maps from years past. The current would carry them nearly a quarter mile before they could reach suitable landing points, but their pursuers would have to find their own crossing or ride miles out of their way to continue the chase. Behind them, the gunmen spurred their horses into the treacherous crossing, firing wildly as they fought to control their mounts in the rushing water. Bullets whined overhead and splashed around them, but the swift current and the spray kicked up by the horses made accurate shooting nearly impossible. It was as they struggled toward the eastern bank that Dasan spotted something that chilled his blood more than the icy river. One of the gunmen's horses bore a distinctive brand burned into its left hip, not the mark of a cattle ranch, but the symbol of the Copper Gulch Mining Consortium, Silas Hartwell's operation. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't random violence or territorial dispute. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to eliminate witnesses to Henry Erickson's murder. The false Apache raid, the professional gunman, the systematic pursuit, all of it pointed to resources and organization that went far beyond simple claim jumping. They reached the muddy East Bank as the surviving gunmen were still fighting their way across the treacherous ford. Dasan helped Clara scramble up the slippery slope, both of them soaked and shivering in the cool morning air. His leg was on fire with pain, but adrenaline and duty kept him moving. The current had swept them nearly a quarter-mile downstream, where a stand of willows offered temporary concealment. Dasan's horse had somehow managed to follow them across, emerging from the water with rolling eyes and labored breathing. The animal's loyalty reminded him of the cavalry mounts he'd ridden during his scouting days, beasts who would carry a man through hell itself, if asked. "Can you ride?" he asked Clara, catching the animal's reins as it stumbled up the bank. She nodded, though her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I can do whatever you need me to do," she managed, showing the kind of courage that would have made her father proud. As Dasan lifted her onto the saddle and swung up behind her, wrapping them both in his damp blanket, he found himself thinking about the long road ahead. They had survived the river crossing, but their enemies knew the territory and had resources he could only guess at. Every mile between here and Willow Springs would be contested ground. But something had changed in the icy waters of the Snake. Clara's trust in him had deepened from desperate necessity to genuine faith, and his own commitment had evolved from duty to something approaching paternal love. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Willow Springs huddled in a natural basin between towering red cliffs, a collection of sun-baked adobe buildings and weathered wooden structures. As Dasan and Clara approached along the dusty main street, the Apache warrior studied the town with the careful attention of a man who had survived too many ambushes to trust peaceful appearances. The settlement buzzed with typical midday activity: teamsters loading wagons bound for the mining camps, ranchers conducting business at the general store. Children playing in the street, while their mothers hung laundry on lines strung between buildings. But beneath the surface normalcy, Dasan's trained eye caught subtle signs of tension. Conversation stopped when strangers passed. The shopkeepers watched the street with more than casual interest, and several men wore their guns with the casual readiness of those expecting trouble. It was the familiar figure lounging outside the Silver Dollar Saloon that made Dasan's blood run cold. Conrad "Blackjack" Morrison wore his deputy's badge like a shield, and his false smile like a weapon as he chatted with a group of well-dressed men. But Dasan recognized him immediately as the leader of the false Apache, who had murdered Henry Erickson, and the same pale eyes, the same cruel mouth, the same arrogant bearing that had marked him as dangerous from their first encounter. "That one," Dasan murmured to Clara, his voice barely audible over the street noise. "He led the men who killed your father." Clara's small body went rigid with a mixture of terror and rage that no child should ever have to feel. Her hands tightened on the leather satchel until her knuckles showed white against her pale skin. In her mind, she could see Conrad's face painted for war, could hear his voice shouting orders as bullets filled the air around her father's wagon. "We have to tell someone," she whispered urgently, her voice carrying a desperate hope that justice still existed in this harsh world. "The sheriff, or a marshal, or—" Dasan replied in Apache, then translated, "The sheriff takes his orders from men like Conrad. We need allies first. Your father was wise to choose the school teacher." As they dismounted near the general store, Dasan caught sight of his reflection in the shop window and realized how they must appear to the townspeople, a limping Apache warrior and a travel-stained white child, both carrying the unmistakable marks of hard travel and recent violence. In this atmosphere of barely contained tension, their presence would draw attention they couldn't afford. The storekeeper, a nervous man with thinning hair and worried eyes, glanced at Dasan's Apache features with a barely concealed unease that had become familiar over 2 decades of living between worlds. His gaze lingered on the Spencer carbine slung across Dasan's back, on the knife at his belt, on the eagle feather in his hair. All the markers that identified him as one of the hostile Apache, who still represented the frontier's deepest fears. "Red Hawk," the storekeeper muttered under his breath, using the name some locals had given Dasan during his scouting days. It was not spoken with affection, and the undertone of suspicion carried clearly in the cramped confines of the store. Before Dasan could respond to the slight, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention back to the street. Conrad was riding toward them with 2 companions, his expression shifting from false bonhomie to the focused intensity of a predator who had spotted vulnerable prey. The deputy's hand rested casually on his gun butt, and his companions spread out in a practiced pattern that spoke of men accustomed to intimidation and violence. "Well, well, well," Conrad called out as he reined in his horse directly in front of them. "Look what we have here, a little lost lamb wandering so far from home." His pale eyes fixed on Clara with unconcealed hunger, the gaze of a man who saw her not as a child, but as an obstacle to be removed. The predatory intensity of his stare made Dasan's skin crawl, reminding him of the way certain officers had looked at Apache women during the worst days of the campaigns. "You must be poor Henry's girl." Conrad continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Terrible thing what happened to your daddy. Apache raiders, they tell me, savage work. But don't you worry none, little miss. Deputy Conrad will take real good care of you." Clara pressed closer to Dasan, but lifted her chin with a courage that would have made her father proud. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear, precise diction of a child who had been raised to speak properly despite their frontier circumstances. "My father is dead." She said her words steady despite the fear that must have been clawing at her heart. "But these men killed him, and they wore Apache clothes to hide what they really are, murderers and thieves." Conrad's laugh was as cold as winter wind in the high country, carrying no warmth or humor, but only the bitter amusement of a man who had moved beyond caring about truth or justice. "Poor little thing's been through such trauma, she's seeing enemies everywhere she looks. Natural thing, I suppose, after witnessing such violence. Don't you worry about those bad dreams, child. Deputy Conrad knows just how to take care of frightened little girls." The words carried implications that made Dasan's hand move instinctively toward his knife hilt. In his years as a scout, he had encountered men like Conrad before, corrupt officials who used their badges as licenses for cruelty, who viewed their authority as permission to take whatever they wanted from those too weak to resist. The thought of Clara falling into such hands sent cold fury through his veins. Conrad reached down from his saddle, his thick fingers grasping for Clara's arm, with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. Dasan's muscles tensed for violence that would solve nothing but might satisfy the rage burning in his chest. But before blood could be spilled in Willow Springs' dusty street, a clear voice rang out across the settlement like a bell, calling the faithful to worship. "That won't be necessary, Deputy Morrison." Beatrice Morrison emerged from the one-room schoolhouse with the bearing of a woman who had faced down drunken cowboys, corrupt officials, and the harsh realities of frontier life without yielding so much as an inch of ground. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from standing up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. As she walked toward them, Beatrice felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of fear and determination that she fought to keep from showing on her face. She had dealt with Conrad Morrison before, knew his reputation for cruelty and corruption, understood that challenging him openly could have consequences that extended far beyond this single confrontation. But the sight of a child in danger had triggered something in her that transcended personal safety. Her simple blue dress and white apron marked her as a respectable woman, but there was steel in her spine and fire in her dark eyes. Her brown hair was pinned back in a practical bun that did nothing to soften the determined set of her jaw as she walked directly toward Conrad's horse without the slightest sign of intimidation. "The child is one of my students." Beatrice continued her voice, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order among unruly children and unrulier adults. Inside, she was calculating rapidly territorial law. Conrad's known associates, the witnesses, present the potential consequences of direct confrontation. But her teacher's instincts had taken over the same protective impulse that made her stand between bullies and their victims in the schoolyard. Conrad's smile curdled into something uglier, his facade of false concern dropping to reveal the cruel reality beneath. "Don't believe I asked for your opinion, schoolmarm. This here's official territorial business, and I got the badge to prove it." "Theo? Then you'll have the proper documentation to go with that badge." Beatrice replied smoothly, her tone as sweet as poisoned honey. Fear still clawed at her stomach, but years of dealing with frontier officials had taught her to use their own rules against them. "Court orders territorial authorization, federal warrants. I assume you have such papers on your person." The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunfight. Conrad's face darkened with anger, but frontier law was clear on such matters. Without proper legal authority clearly documented and properly witnessed, he could not simply take Clara, especially with half the town watching from doorways and windows. Beatrice pressed her advantage, her teacher's mind working through the legal precedents she had studied during her correspondence course in territorial law. Article 12 of the Territorial Code clearly states that custody transfers require written authorization from a circuit judge or territorial marshal. I assume you have such authorization. "This ain't over," Conrad growled, wheeling his horse around with unnecessary violence. The animal shied and snorted, responding to its rider's barely controlled rage. "Not by a long shot, it ain't." As Conrad and his men rode away, trailing dust and muttered threats, Beatrice quickly ushered Clara and Dasan toward the schoolhouse. Her movements were brisk and efficient, those of a woman who understood that danger had many faces and patience was not among its virtues. But inside she was shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and the realization of what she had just committed herself to. "Inside quickly," she said, her voice urgent but controlled. "We have much to discuss and little time for pleasantries." The schoolhouse was a simple structure with wooden benches arranged in neat rows, a cast-iron stove for winter heating, and a blackboard covered with the day's lessons in arithmetic and grammar. Beatrice barred the door behind them and drew the curtains across the windows before turning to face her unexpected visitors. As she looked at Clara, really looked at her for the first time, Beatrice felt her heart clench with sympathy and recognition. This was not just any frightened child, but the daughter Henry Erickson had written about with such love and pride. The same clear blue eyes, the same stubborn set to her chin that had marked her father as a man who would not be easily broken. "I received your father's letter 3 weeks ago." Beatrice told Clara gently, her manner softening as she knelt to the child's eye level. "I've been watching for you since word came about the attack. I'm so very sorry for your loss, Clara. Henry was a good man who deserved far better than what happened to him." The words came from the heart, carrying the weight of genuine grief for a man she had never met, but had come to admire through his correspondence. Henry's letters had painted a picture of someone struggling to build a better life for his daughter. Someone who understood the value of education and moral character in a land where both were often in short supply. Clara's careful composure finally cracked at hearing her father's name spoken with genuine warmth and respect. She buried her face in Beatrice's shoulder and sobbed with the desperate intensity of a child who had been forced to be strong for too long. The schoolteacher held her with fierce protectiveness, her own eyes bright with unshed tears as she felt the full weight of the responsibility Henry had placed on her shoulders. Over Clara's head, Beatrice's gaze met Dassan's, and she saw in his steady regard the recognition of a kindred spirit. She had heard of Red Hawk, the Apache scout, whose integrity was legendary even among those who despised his heritage. Stories of his fairness, his courage, his refusal to compromise his principles, even when ordered to do so by superior officers. Looking at him now, she could see the truth of those stories in his weathered features and steady gaze. Henry mentioned in his letter that you might escort Clara to safety, Beatrice said to Dassan, her voice carrying genuine respect. I know your reputation. You're a man of honor in a land where such men are increasingly rare. Dassan inclined his head slightly, uncomfortable with praise, but grateful for her understanding. In his experience, white women were often the most fearful of Apache presence, the most likely to see threat where none existed. Beatrice's calm acceptance of his protection spoke of a character that transcended the prejudices of her time and place. Dassan said in Apache, then translated, "The men who killed her father were not Apache. They wore stolen clothes and used military weapons, but their war paint was the work of children. Conrad led them, but he was not the one who gave the orders. Conrad Morrison is corrupt to his very bones." Beatrice agreed, her voice tight with long-suppressed anger. She had been documenting territorial corruption for over a year, carefully recording incidents of abuse and violence that painted a damning picture of how certain officials had systematically looted the territory. He takes his orders from whoever pays him best, and between bribes and intimidation, he's turned half this territory into a personal playground for criminals. She led them through a trapdoor in the schoolhouse floor, revealing a small cellar where she stored supplies. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on wooden crates filled with food and medical supplies, provisions that Dassan suspected frequently found their way to Apache families on the nearby reservation. The sight confirmed his initial assessment of her character. This was a woman who acted on her principles regardless of social approval. "Show me what your father left you," Beatrice said to Clara once they were safely concealed below ground. With trembling hands, Clara opened the leather satchel and withdrew the mining deed. Beatrice studied it carefully by lamplight, her teacher's eye noting every detail of the official seals and surveyor's marks that established its legal authenticity. Years of correspondence courses in territorial law had given her enough expertise to recognize genuine documents, and this one bore all the proper markings. Quicksilver Mine. She read aloud, her voice carrying a note of surprise. $20,000 worth of silver ore filed and recorded in Pima County. Your father did everything exactly right, Clara. This deed is legal and binding under territorial law. She also examined the tin locket, opening it to reveal Henry's careful sketch of the mine's layout. But it was the engraved coat of arms on the inner lid that caught her attention, 3 crowns above a stylized tree, worn smooth by years of handling, but still clearly visible. "This looks like European heraldry," Beatrice murmured, running her finger over the worn design. "Your mother's family crest, perhaps. The workmanship is quite fine. This wasn't made by a frontier silversmith." Before Clara could answer, the acrid smell of smoke drifted through the floorboards above. Dasan was on his feet instantly, his warrior's instincts screaming warnings as he peered through a crack between the cellar's wooden planks. Orange flames were licking hungrily at the schoolhouse's eastern wall, fed by coal oil and the dry desert wind. Dark figures moved in the shadows beyond the fire, their shapes barely visible against the flickering light. The attack was systematic and professional, not the work of drunken cowboys or random vandals, but of men who understood how to use fire as a weapon. "They're trying to burn us out," Dasan said grimly, his hand moving to his rifle. "Force us into the open where Conrad's men can finish what they started." Beatrice felt her stomach drop as she realized the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just harassment or intimidation. This was attempted murder disguised as accidental fire. The schoolhouse represented everything she had worked for in Willow Springs, the hopes and dreams of dozens of children who might never have another chance at education. But more than that, it was her sanctuary, the place where she had felt safe and purposeful, in a world that often seemed hostile to both safety and purpose. The thought of losing it to Conrad's cruelty filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. "The well's behind the building," she said, her voice steady despite the mortal danger they faced. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford with Clara's life at stake. "We have to save the school. It's the only one these children have for 50 miles in any direction." What followed was a desperate race against fire and time. Dasan and Beatrice formed a bucket brigade, racing between the well and the burning wall, while Clara hauled smaller containers of water despite her exhaustion and fear. The flames spread with terrifying speed along the dry wooden siding, crackling and roaring like some ancient beast awakened from slumber. For Beatrice, each bucket of water represented more than just fire suppression. It was a battle for everything she believed in, everything she had worked to build in this harsh country. The schoolhouse was more than just a building. It was proof that civilization could take root even in the most unlikely places, that education and moral character could flourish alongside the harsh realities of frontier life. Dasan, despite his injured leg screaming with each trip up and down the ladder, found himself thinking of similar fires during the Apache campaigns. Villages burned by both sides in a conflict where civilians always paid the highest price. The sight of flames consuming something precious and irreplaceable awakened old angers and older sorrows, driving him to push beyond his physical limits. It was during one frantic trip to the roof that disaster struck. Dasan had climbed the schoolhouse's makeshift ladder, bucket in hand, when a burning ember dropped onto his shirt sleeve. As he beat out the small fire, his injured leg gave way beneath him, and his footing slipped on the steep wooden shingles. Beatrice saw him falling and moved without conscious thought, dropping her own bucket to position herself beneath him. They collided in a tangle of arms and legs, rolling away from the burning building as flaming debris rained down around them like hellish snow. For a moment that seemed to last forever, they lay pressed together in the dirt, breathing hard from exertion and terror. Dasan could smell the scent of her hair soap and desert sage, and something uniquely feminine that made his pulse quicken despite their desperate circumstances. Beatrice could feel the solid strength of his chest beneath her palms, could see the concern in his dark eyes as he checked her for injuries despite his own obvious pain. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual, his hands gentle as they brushed soot from her face. "I'm fine," she replied, but she made no immediate move to pull away from his protective embrace. There was something in this moment. Danger's shared trust demonstrated the recognition of two people who would risk everything for what they believed in, that transcended the social barriers between them. Their faces were only inches apart, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. For one impossible moment, the fire and danger faded away, leaving only the recognition of something precious and fragile growing between them. "Right here, right now," Dasan murmured in Apache, the words meaning, "right here, right now," carrying implications deeper than their literal translation. In his mind, he was thinking of his grandmother's teachings about the moments when the spirit chooses its path, when duty and desire align in perfect harmony. Then Clara's frightened cry shattered the spell, reminding them that a child's life hung in the balance of their choices. They separated reluctantly, both understanding that duty came before desire, that survival took precedence over whatever feelings might be stirring in their hearts. The fire was finally extinguished as full darkness fell over Willow Springs, but the damage was significant. The schoolhouse's eastern wall was charred and blackened, several windows had cracked from the heat, and the acrid smell of burned wood would linger for weeks. But the building stood, and more importantly, the evidence of Clara's legal claim had been protected. "They wanted to destroy the evidence," Beatrice said, examining the mining deed by lamplight. The papers had been protected by the cellar's stone walls, but the message was clear: Conrad would stop at nothing to claim what he saw as rightfully his. "We leave at first light." "We leave at first light," Dasan decided, his tone brooking no argument. Every hour they delayed gave their enemies more time to plan their next move, and he had no illusions about Conrad's willingness to escalate the violence. "Every moment we stay here puts you in danger, as well as Clara." Clara, exhausted by the night's terrors, had fallen asleep, curled in a corner of the cellar. Dasan spread his blanket over her small form and settled down to keep watch, his rifle across his knees and his senses attuned to every sound from the street above. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like an old coat, bringing with it the clarity of purpose that had sustained him through 20 years of military service. "You don't have to come with us," he told Beatrice as she moved about the damaged schoolhouse, salvaging what she could from the wreckage. "This isn't your fight." Beatrice paused in her work to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like stars in a midnight sky. "A child's life and future are at stake," she replied with quiet conviction. "That makes it everyone's fight who has a conscience left." She showed him a leather-bound ledger filled with careful handwriting dates, names and incidents of corruption and violence that painted a comprehensive picture of how certain officials had systematically looted the territory. "Besides, I've been documenting territorial corruption for months. It's past time someone with real authority heard the evidence." As the night deepened and Clara slept the exhausted sleep of childhood innocence, Dasan found himself studying Beatrice's face in the lamplight. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her manner too direct for society's narrow expectations of feminine grace. But there was something in her steady gaze, in the way she had stood up to Conrad without flinching, that spoke to something deep in his warrior's heart. The way she moved through the damaged schoolhouse, carefully preserving what could be saved while accepting what was lost, reminded him of his grandmother preparing for the long march to the reservation. There was the same practical acceptance of harsh reality, combined with absolute refusal to surrender hope or principle. She had noticed his scrutiny and met his eyes without coquetry or false modesty. "What are you thinking?" she asked simply. "You are not what I expected." He admitted his English, carrying the formal cadence that marked him as someone who had learned the language from books and military manuals rather than cradle songs. "When Henry spoke of the school teacher, I pictured someone different. Someone who would need protecting instead of offering help," she said with a slight smile that held no offense. "Someone weak." He nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "We a du holo." He said in Apache, then translated, "I have learned to expect little from white settlers. Too many promises broken, too many treaties forgotten. Too many people who speak of justice but practice only convenience. And I have learned that Apache warriors are not the savages the territorial newspapers make them out to be." She replied softly, "Perhaps this journey will teach us both that the world is more complicated than our prejudices would have us believe." The conversation continued in quiet tones as they shared the watch, each taking turns to rest, while the other maintained vigilance. Beatrice found herself fascinated by Dasan's perspective on the territorial conflicts, his insider's view of military operations she had only heard about through official reports and newspaper accounts. His descriptions of specific battles and campaigns painted a very different picture from the heroic narratives promoted by territorial officials. In turn, Dasan learned about Beatrice's background, her education in Eastern schools. Her decision to come west despite family objections, her daily struggles to maintain standards of learning and moral instruction in a community that often viewed both as luxuries. Her dedication to documenting injustice spoke of a commitment to truth that transcended personal safety or social acceptance. Outside, the desert wind moaned through the damaged eaves of the schoolhouse, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. Somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were planning the next move in a deadly game where the stakes were measured in gold and blood. But in the small circle of lamplight that held back the night, 3 souls had found each other, despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and experiences. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, and quite possibly death for all of them. Tonight, however, Clara slept safely under Dasan's protection, while Beatrice Morrison had proven herself a guardian worth having in any fight. It was more than the Apache warrior had dared hope for when he first found the frightened child hiding in the greasewood. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Arizona territory, bringing with it the promise of another day in the crucible of survival. Dasan had spent the hours before sunrise checking their gear and studying the hand-drawn maps in Beatrice's school atlas, plotting a route that would keep them away from the main roads where Conrad's men would be watching. Their small party made an unlikely sight as they prepared to leave Willow Springs in the pre-dawn darkness. Dasan sat his sturdy cavalry horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his Spencer carbine slung across his back, and his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. Clara perched behind him, the precious satchel secured between them, her small hands gripping his belt with the desperate strength of a child who had already lost too much. Beatrice had borrowed a mule from Emmett Walsh, the struggling farmer whose water rights had been stolen by corrupt officials working for one of the territory's cattle barons. The animal was stubborn and ill-tempered, but it would carry her and their meager supplies with a reliability that had made mules the preferred transport of frontier traders. "The circuit judge won't reach Crow's Landing until Tuesday," Beatrice said as they rode through the settlement's sleeping streets. Her voice carried the careful control of someone who had spent the night alternating between vigilance and planning. "That gives us 4 days to get there ahead of any trouble." Dasan replied in Apache, then translated grimly. "Trouble has already found us. The question is whether we can stay ahead of it long enough to reach help." Indeed, he had spotted Conrad's men positioned at strategic points around the town during his pre-dawn reconnaissance, one near the livery stable, another by the general store, a third lounging outside the saloon despite the early hour. The deputy was thorough in his preparations, and his network of informants meant that their departure had probably been noted before they reached the town limits. They had traveled barely 3 miles from Willow Springs when the pursuit began in earnest. The first shots rang out from a ridge behind them, the reports echoing across the high desert like thunder from a cloudless sky. Dust geysers erupted around their horses' hooves as Conrad's men opened fire from concealed positions among the rocks and scrub brush. "They've been tracking us since we left town," Dasan said, urging his horse to a faster pace, while keeping one arm protectively around Clara. His mind was already calculating distances and terrain, looking for advantages they could exploit against superior numbers and firepower. What followed was a running battle across terrain that alternated between sun-baked flats and twisting canyon systems carved by centuries of flash floods. Conrad's posse had the advantage of fresh horses and superior numbers. But Dasan knew this country with the intimate familiarity of a man who had spent 20 years reading its moods and secrets. He led them through a maze of arroyos and hidden valleys, using every trick of concealment and misdirection learned during his years as an army scout. The landscape itself became their ally dry washes that offered temporary concealment rock formations that provided cover from rifle-fire animal trails that wound through country too rough for rapid pursuit. But their pursuers were persistent and well-organized, and the sound of gunfire grew closer with each mile they covered. Conrad's voice could sometimes be heard across the canyons as he coordinated his scattered men, his commands carrying clearly in the thin desert air. It was during a brief halt to rest their exhausted animals that real danger struck. A single gunman had worked his way around their flank, using the broken country to approach within rifle range of their temporary shelter. His first shot shattered a boulder inches from Clara's head, sending stone fragments flying like shrapnel. "Take the carbine," Dasan told Beatrice, pressing the Spencer into her hands with urgent intensity. For a moment their palms touched on the weapon's stock, his calloused fingers covering her softer ones as he showed her how to work the lever action. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through both of them. The recognition of strength, meeting strength, courage, acknowledging courage. In that instant, Beatrice felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the understanding that Clara's life might depend on her ability to overcome her own moral reservations about violence. "I've never shot at a person before," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. The schoolteacher in her recoiled from the thought of deliberately harming another human being. But the protector in her understood that some situations left no room for moral luxury. Dasan replied in Apache, then translated, "Today, you learn to write with bullets. Breathe slowly, squeeze gently. The girl's life may depend on your aim." Beatrice's first shot went wide, the bullet striking earth 20 yards from their attacker. But the act of pulling the trigger broke through her psychological barrier, and her second attempt was guided by the determination that had carried her through every challenge of frontier life. The bullet found its mark, not killing the gunman, but wounding his horse badly enough to put him out of the fight. "Well done," Dasan said, using the Apache expression for "well done," and the quiet pride in his voice sent warmth flooding through Beatrice's chest, despite their desperate circumstances. As they resumed their flight, Beatrice found herself grappling with the aftermath of her actions. She had always believed in solving problems through reason, and moral suasion had built her entire adult life around the principle that education and understanding could overcome any obstacle. The necessity of violence, even in defense of an innocent child, challenged her most fundamental beliefs about human nature and social progress. But looking at Clara's frightened face, feeling the weight of the child's trust and dependence, she understood that some principles were worth compromising for the sake of higher truths. Protection of the innocent was not just a moral imperative, but a sacred duty that transcended personal comfort or philosophical consistency. They pressed on through the furnace heat of midday, following game trails and forgotten Apache paths that wound through country most white men had never seen. The pursuit continued relentlessly, but Dasan's knowledge of the terrain and his ability to read the landscape kept them just ahead of their enemies. It was near the San Pedro River ford that they encountered unexpected help. Dr. Walter Henley sat beside the trail, tending to a cowhand who had taken a bullet in the shoulder during what appeared to be a dispute over water rights. The frontier physician's mule stood patiently nearby, its panniers loaded with the instruments and medicines of his trade. Beatrice Morrison, Dr. Henley said with genuine pleasure, recognizing the schoolteacher despite her travel-stained appearance and the urgency of their flight. What brings you to this God-forsaken corner of creation? She quickly explained their situation, while Dasan kept watch for pursuers, his senses attuned to every sound that might herald another attack. Dr. Henley listened with growing concern, his weathered face grave as he absorbed the implications of her story. "I've suspected corruption in the territorial government for months," he said finally, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much injustice to be easily shocked. "Just last week, I treated 3 different men who'd been beaten by Conrad's deputies for asking questions about missing cattle. And there was that family near Copper Gulch who died in their cabin fire, very convenient timing considering they'd been asking about mineral rights." The doctor's words painted a picture of systematic violence and intimidation that went far beyond Clara's personal tragedy. This was territorial corruption on a scale that threatened the very foundations of law and order, the kind of organized criminality that could only flourish with official protection and systematic cover-up. "Here, take this," Dr. Henley said, handing Beatrice a leather medical bag containing laudanum bandages and other supplies that might mean the difference between life and death in the trials ahead. "You'll need these before this business is finished. And I'll send word to the Army Patrol at Fort Huachuca so they should know what's happening in their territory." The river crossing proved treacherous beyond their worst expectations. Spring snowmelt had turned the normally placid Snake into a raging torrent that swept away anything foolish enough to challenge its power. The ford that had been safe a week earlier was now a death trap of churning water and hidden rocks. Dasan's horse slipped on the treacherous bottom, its hooves unable to find secure purchase on the slick stones. For a terrifying moment, it seemed they might all be swept away by the current, Clara's frightened cry barely audible over the water's roar. Dasan called to her in Apache, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Trust the water. It carries us to safety if we do not fight it." It was then that Dasan showed the true measure of his character. Despite his old leg injury, despite the constant pain he tried so carefully to hide, he dismounted into the chest-deep current to guide them across manually. The icy water crashed over his head as he fought to maintain his footing, blood seeping from his reopened wound to color the rushing stream crimson. Each step sent daggers of pain through his shattered bones, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. In his mind, he could hear his grandfather's voice teaching him about the warrior's path, how true strength came not from the absence of pain, but from the willingness to endure it for the sake of others. The old man had taught him that a warrior's worth was measured not by the enemies he killed, but by the innocents he saved. Beatrice watched him struggle against the torrent, saw how he gritted his teeth against the agony in his shattered leg, and felt something profound shift in her understanding of who this man truly was. This was not the savage described in territorial newspapers. This was someone who would sacrifice everything for the safety of others, who embodied the highest ideals of honor and service regardless of the personal cost. When Beatrice's mule balked at the deepest part of the crossing, Dasan waded back to help despite his own exhaustion and pain. For a moment they stood together in the rushing water, their bodies pressed close by necessity, their breathing synchronized by shared effort against the relentless current. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice soft with concern, as she saw the red stain spreading through the water around his leg. "I will endure for her sake," he replied in Apache, then translated, "I will endure for her sake. Pain is temporary, but a child's life is precious beyond measure." His dark eyes met hers in the spray and chaos, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with their desperate flight, and everything to do with the recognition of souls that complemented each other perfectly. In that moment, Beatrice understood that she was looking at a man who measured his worth not by what he could take from the world, but by what he could give to it. They finally reached the eastern bank as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, all three of them soaked and shivering, but alive. The delay had cost them precious time, but it had also cost their pursuers, who would have to find their own way across the swollen river or ride miles out of their way to continue the chase. As night fell over the high desert, they sought shelter in the ruins of an abandoned way station, its stone walls offering protection from both the elements and prying eyes. Clara fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's terrors, while Dassan and Beatrice kept watch in shifts. It was during the quiet hours after midnight that their growing attraction finally found voice, though, in the oblique way of people who understood that survival came before personal desires. "You listen well to what the land tells you," Beatrice said quietly as she tended the reopened wound on Dassan's leg, her fingers gentle on his skin as she cleaned away the dried blood. The intimacy of the moment, caring for his injuries, while he maintained vigilance against their enemies, created a bubble of tenderness in the midst of their harsh circumstances. "You keep us alive with your courage," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. The feel of her soft hands on his scarred flesh awakened sensations he had thought buried with his military career. A warrior could ask for no better battle companion. Their faces were only inches apart in the flickering light of their small fire, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his dark eyes, could feel the controlled strength in the muscles of his leg. There was something building between them, something that had nothing to do with their desperate flight and everything to do with the recognition of kindred spirits who shared the same fundamental values. "In the old ways of my people," Dassan said softly, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "Auk Ida Bahodini, a warrior who protects another's child, becomes family. Blood of the heart, not blood of the body. But there are other bonds as well, bonds between those who choose to walk the same path through danger." "And what am I in the old ways?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He studied her face in the firelight, seeing past the practical facade to the strength and compassion that lay beneath. "Shikai," he said finally, using the Apache word that meant "my woman," but carried implications of partnership and equality that no English translation could capture. "The one who stands beside me by choice, not by obligation." Akam. It was not a declaration of love in the romantic sense, but something deeper and more enduring, the acknowledgement of partnership forged in the crucible of shared danger. Neither of them spoke of the future, for in this harsh land the future was measured in hours rather than years. But something had been acknowledged between them, something that would endure regardless of what tomorrow might bring. As they talked through the quiet hours, sharing stories of their past and hopes for whatever future they might have, both of them began to understand that they had found something rare and precious in each other. Not the passionate romance of dime novels, but the deeper recognition of souls that had chosen the same difficult path through a world that often rewarded cynicism and cruelty over principle and courage. The night wind stirred the ashes of their fire, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of storms to come. Somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were plotting the next move in a deadly game, where the stakes were measured in blood and gold. But in the circle of firelight that held back the night, three souls had found something worth fighting for, not just Clara's inheritance or the abstract concept of justice, but the bonds of family forged by choice rather than chance. The abandoned barn stood like a weathered sentinel against the pre-dawn sky, its wooden sides gray with age and desert winds. Emmett Walsh had guided them here through a maze of irrigation ditches and forgotten cattle trails, his guilt-ridden face telling the story of a man caught between duty to family and the demands of conscience. Clara sat in the dusty hay, her small fingers working at the catch of her father's locket, while Dasan kept watch through a gap in the barn siding. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder. With each passing moment, Conrad's men were closing in, guided by Emmett's reluctant cooperation. "I had to do it," Emmett said miserably, his voice thick with shame as he paced the confines of their hiding place. His hands shook as he spoke, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience. "Conrad threatened Sarah and the baby. Said if I didn't help track you down, he'd make sure they ended up like Henry Erickson. You got to understand, I got a family to protect too." "Tahuila," Dasan said quietly in Apache, then translated, "We understand. A man's first duty is to his family. The fault lies with those who force such choices, not with those who make them." Beatrice nodded her agreement, though her hand rested on the pistol at her waist. She had seen too many good people corrupted by fear and desperation to judge Emmett harshly. But she also understood that understanding his motives didn't eliminate the danger he represented. It was then that Clara made a discovery that would change everything. The locket's inner mechanism, damaged during their harrowing flight across the desert, finally gave way under her persistent efforts. Behind her father's careful sketch of the mine shaft lay another piece of paper folded so small it had escaped notice until now, and something else that made her gasp in recognition. Wrapped in oiled silk was the carved bone knife handle she had seen fall from Silas's saddle during the attack. The hunting knife Henry had crafted as a Christmas gift, etched with Silas's initials and a small heart. Her father had retrieved it, somehow kept it as evidence of his friend's betrayal. "Uncle Silas." Clara whispered the childhood name, carrying the weight of heartbreak and betrayal. In her mind, she could see him last Christmas morning, tears in his eyes, as he'd examined the knife Henry had carved for him. He'd swept her up in a bear hug, spinning her around, while declaring it the finest gift he'd ever received. The same man had ordered her father's death. The paper was an assay report from the Copper Gulch mining office, signed and dated 3 months before her father's death. But it was the signature that confirmed their worst fears, Silas Hartwell's careful script documenting ore samples that should have belonged to Henry's claim. Sarah Walsh, watching the trail for pursuit, suddenly gasped in recognition. "That handwriting, I've seen it before. Silas brings produce to town sometimes. His receipts for eggs and vegetables are always signed the same way." The implications hit them like a physical blow. They had been running from the wrong enemy, trusting in the wrong assumptions, building their defense against the wrong attack. This wasn't about some distant cattle baron or territorial corruption in the abstract. This was about Silas Hartwell using Henry's legal deed to legitimize his own illegal operation. For Emmett, the revelation brought a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the conspiracy was smaller and more focused than he had feared, horror at the realization of how deeply personal and vicious the betrayal had been. "Damn." Dasan breathed in Apache, the expletive carrying the weight of sudden, terrible understanding. "Sweet Lord in heaven." Emmett whispered the full scope of the deception dawning in his eyes. Silas has been running ore through the Quicksilver mine for months. Been selling it through contacts in Tucson, keeping it quiet, waiting for the right moment to make it all legal. Dasan studied the assay report with the careful attention of a man whose life had depended on reading sign correctly. The dates, the ore samples, the careful documentation, it all pointed to a systematic theft that had been going on far longer than Henry's recent discovery. Silas needed the deed to make his operation legitimate. Beatrice set her schoolteacher's mind working through the logical progression of events. But he also needed Henry and Clara dead so no one could challenge his version of events. "And Conrad?" Clara asked, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that no child should possess. "Conrad's been working for Silas all along." Emmett replied bitterly, his face flushed with anger at his own gullibility. "Silas promised him a share of the profits if he could eliminate the rightful owners and deliver the deed. That badge gives him the authority to make it all look legal." The revelation shattered their understanding of the situation completely. They had been fleeing from a vast criminal conspiracy, when in reality they faced a desperate mine foreman and his corrupt deputy ally. Silas was not the powerful antagonist they had imagined, but he was infinitely more dangerous because of his desperation and because of the personal nature of his betrayal. But Emmett's forced cooperation had created another crisis. Even as they absorbed the shocking truth about Silas, the sound of approaching riders grew closer. Conrad's men were following the irrigation ditches exactly as Emmett had promised, and there was nowhere left to run. "I have to guide them like I said I would," Emmett said miserably, his voice breaking with the strain of his impossible position. "If I don't show up, they'll know something's wrong and take it out on my family." "Then you'll guide them," Dasan said grimly, his mind already working through the tactical possibilities. "But not where they expect to go." He spread his map on the barn floor and began sketching alternate routes with a piece of charcoal from the cold fire. "Take them through Blind Horse Canyon," he told Emmett, pointing to a narrow defile that led nowhere but deeper into the desert wastes. "Tell them it's a shortcut to intercept us on the road to Crow's Landing. The old Apache trail that winds through the canyon will keep them busy for hours." "And us?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady despite the mortal danger that surrounded them. "We go to the mine," Clara said with startling resolve, her 11-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. "We get the proof we need to stop Uncle Silas once and for all." It was a desperate plan, perhaps even suicidal. But as Dasan looked into Clara's determined blue eyes, he realized that the frightened child he had found hiding in the greasewood was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had inherited not just her father's stubborn courage, but something indefinable that spoke of noble blood and aristocratic will. "Yes," he said in Apache, then nodded. "To the mine, then. But first we must send these hunters on a false trail." The sound of gunfire erupted from the canyon mouth as Conrad's men discovered Emmett's deception. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as the pursuers spread out in a search pattern, and their angry voices carrying clearly across the desert. But the false trail would buy them precious time, and Emmett's sacrifice would not be in vain. "Go!" Emmett urged them, his face set with the grim determination of a man who had finally chosen his side. "I'll keep them busy as long as I can, but they'll figure out the truth eventually." Sarah pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into Beatrice's hands, bread and dried meat that might keep them alive in the trials ahead. "Take care of each other," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "And remember us kindly when this is all over." They slipped from the barn into the gray light of dawn, three small figures against the vast emptiness of the high desert. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew fainter as Conrad's men followed false trails deeper into the wasteland. Ahead lay the Copper Gulch and whatever truth waited in the depths of the Quicksilver Mine. The Quicksilver Mine crouched against the red sandstone cliffs of Copper Gulch like some great wounded beast, its head frame and ore chutes black against the afternoon sky. What should have been a silent monument to played-out dreams instead hummed with activity. The rhythmic hammering of machinery, the scrape of shovels against stone, the distant voices of men who had no legal right to be there. Dasan studied the illegal operation through field glasses borrowed from Dr. Henley's medical kit, his trained eye cataloging details that would have escaped a less experienced observer. At least 15 men worked the site, far more than any legitimate mining operation would require for a supposedly exhausted claim. They were armed, too. Rifle barrels glinted in the harsh sunlight as guards took positions around the mine's perimeter. "It's bigger than I expected," he told Beatrice, handing her the glasses so she could see for herself. She examined the scene with the methodical attention to detail that made her such an effective teacher and chronicler of territorial injustice. "Look at those ore wagons," she said after a long moment. "They're loaded and ready to move out. Silas must be planning to ship everything he can before we have a chance to expose his operation." Clara crouched beside them in the shelter of a sandstone outcropping, her small fingers tracing the lines of her father's sketch, as if the drawing could somehow speak and tell them what they needed to know. "Shaft 3 is where Papa found the richest ore," she said with quiet certainty. "If we can prove Silas is mining there illegally, we'll have all the evidence we need." The first drops of rain began to fall as they planned their approach, fat, heavy droplets that struck the desert sand with audible impact and filled the air with the scent of creosote and sage. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the rumble of thunder promised a storm that would either provide cover for their desperate mission or trap them in the open, with nowhere to hide. The weather was changing with the sudden violence that characterized this high country, transforming from blazing heat to the kind of deluge that could turn dry washes into raging torrents in a matter of minutes. It was both opportunity and danger, blessing and curse rolled into one. They were still 100 yards from the mine entrance when Silas Hartwell himself appeared, flanked by 4 armed men whose faces bore the hard lines of professional killers. The mine foreman was a lean, weathered man in his 40s, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent working under the merciless Arizona sun. But his eyes held the desperate gleam of a cornered animal, a man who had gambled everything and could not afford to lose. "Well, well, well," Silas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance, despite the rising wind. "If it isn't little Clara and her Apache friend, come to see what real mining looks like." Clara stood up from behind their cover, her 11-year-old voice cutting through the desert wind like a blade of tempered steel. "Uncle Silas." The childhood name carried such pain that even his hardened men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the sound of innocence betrayed. For just a moment, Silas's face crumpled with something that might have been remorse. The sight of Clara's trusting confusion and the memory of all the evenings he'd spent bouncing her on his knee and telling her stories, the weight of what he had done it all crashed together in a moment of devastating self-awareness. "Clara, little one, you shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your papa. Henry was my best friend, but he was going to take what I'd worked 5 years to find. I couldn't let that happen. You gave him that knife for Christmas," Clara said, pulling the carved handle from her pocket. Her words carried the terrible clarity of a child confronting adult evil. "He loved you like a brother. We both did." Silas's rifle wavered in his grip as he stared at the bone handle, the gift he had treasured, the symbol of a friendship he had destroyed through suspicion and greed. "I know, child. I know. But I found that ore first. I've been bleeding myself dry working these claims while Henry played at being a prospector. When he struck that vein, he acted like it was all his doing, like I was just some hired hand." "Papa always said you were partners," Clara replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He was going to split everything with you. 50-50, just like you agreed." "Lies." Silas snarled, his momentary weakness replaced by desperate anger. He filed that deed in his name only. His name. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, he was going to cut me out. The rain was falling harder now, turning the ground slick and treacherous beneath their feet. Lightning split the sky overhead, and the crash of thunder that followed seemed to shake the very earth. In the distance, the sound of the mine's machinery had stopped, replaced by the ominous silence that preceded nature's most violent displays. "He wasn't cutting you out," Clara said with desperate conviction, her voice rising to be heard over the thunder. "He had papers drawn up, legal papers making you a full partner. They're in the satchel Papa was going to surprise you at dinner." The words hit Silas like physical blows, each revelation driving deeper into his consciousness, the magnitude of his mistake. No, that's not. He never said. Because it was supposed to be a surprise. Clara screamed over the thunder, her small voice carrying all the anguish of a child trying to make sense of adult madness. "For your birthday next week, he spent 3 months with the lawyers in Tucson, making sure everything was legal and fair." The truth crashed over Silas like a tidal wave of devastating clarity. He staggered backward, his rifle dropping to his side as the full scope of his error became clear. He had murdered his best friend based on suspicion and wounded pride, had orphaned a child he loved, like his own daughter, had destroyed everything good in his life, all for nothing. The partnership papers he had imagined as instruments of betrayal were actually proof of Henry's continued trust and generosity. The secrecy he had interpreted as deception was actually evidence of a friend preparing a loving surprise. Every assumption he had made, every justification he had constructed for his actions, crumbled into ash in the face of Clara's innocent revelation. But before the moment of clarity could take hold, Conrad Morrison stepped forward with his weapon raised. "Enough talk." The deputy snarled, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "Dead witnesses can't testify in court, and we've wasted enough time on sentiment." The first shot sent them diving for cover as the storm reached its full fury. But instead of engaging in another running battle across open ground, Dassan made a tactical decision that would change everything. "The mine," he said urgently, rain streaming down his face as he grabbed Clara's hand. "Shaft 3. We get inside, force them to follow us into confined space where their numbers won't matter." They sprinted through the driving rain toward the mine entrance bullets, kicking up mud around their feet. The wooden head frame loomed above them like a gallows, but the dark mouth of Shaft 3 offered the only escape from the killing field of the open ground. They plunged into the mine just as Silas recovered from his emotional shock and began shouting orders to his men. The narrow wooden stairs descended into absolute darkness, the air growing cooler and thinner with each step downward. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit echoed down the main shaft, boots on wood, the scrape of weapons against stone, voices distorted by the enclosed space. "There's equipment down here," Beatrice said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space as she felt along the rough walls. "Pulleys, ropes, or carts. We can use them to slow them down." Clara pulled out her father's sketch, studying it by the flickering light of an oil lamp they'd found near the entrance. The drawing showed not just the main workings, but also the ventilation systems and emergency exits that Henry had carefully mapped during his survey. "There's a side tunnel about 50 yards down," she said with growing excitement, her finger tracing the lines her father had drawn with such care. "Papa marked it as a safety exit. It connects to an old ventilation shaft that comes out near the canyon rim." Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Silas's voice carried clearly in the enclosed space. "They can't get far. The mine only has one way out, and we're standing in it. Spread out and search every tunnel." But Henry Erickson had been a thorough man, and his survey of the Quicksilver had revealed secrets that Silas had never discovered. Following Clara's directions and her father's careful notations, they found the narrow side tunnel that branched off from the main shaft. The passage was barely wide enough for a grown man carved through solid rock by miners from an earlier era. Water dripped from the ceiling with a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the seconds of their lives, and the air was thick with the smell of dampness and long-abandoned dreams. This leads to the old Spanish diggings. Clara whispered, her voice barely audible in the confined space. Papa found them when he was surveying. He said they were at least 100 years old, maybe more. They moved through the darkness by feel and instinct, their hands trailing along the rough stone walls for guidance. The rock was cold and wet beneath their fingers, slick with moisture that had been accumulating for decades. Behind them, the sounds of search grew fainter as Silas's men spread out through the main workings, unaware that their quarry had found an escape route that wasn't marked on any official survey. But the old workings held dangers of their own. The timber supports were rotten with age, and the sound of shifting earth suggested that the structural integrity was severely compromised. Worse, the storm above was sending water down through cracks in the rock, turning the tunnel floor into a muddy quagmire that sucked at their boots with each step. "The lamp's going out," Beatrice said with forced calm, though Dasan could hear the fear in her voice. "We're running out of oil." The flame flickered lower with each passing moment, casting wild shadows on the tunnel walls that seemed to dance with malevolent life. Soon they would be in complete darkness, navigating by touch and sound through passages that might collapse at any moment. It was then that Clara made a discovery that would save their lives. Her small fingers trailing along the tunnel wall, as she had been taught, found a sequence of carved marks that stood out from the natural texture of the stone Apache symbols that had been chiseled into the rock with careful precision. "Hojuji Nasha." Dasan breathed, recognizing the markings immediately. "The Beauty Way, a blessing for safe passage." My people used these tunnels long before the Spanish came, perhaps centuries before. Following the ancient trail markers, they climbed steadily upward through passages that grew narrower and more treacherous with each step. The Apache symbols appeared at regular intervals, carved by hands that had understood the importance of providing guidance for those who might follow. Some of the marks were so old, they were barely visible, worn smooth by countless fingers that had traced their outlines in the darkness. The lamp finally guttered out completely, leaving them in absolute darkness that seemed to press against their faces like black velvet. But the Apache trail signs continued to guide them toward the surface, each carved symbol a message of hope from the distant past. It was Clara who first saw the faint gray light filtering down from above, a dim illumination that seemed impossibly bright after the complete darkness of the tunnels. The entrance to the ventilation shaft beckoned from 50 feet above, promising fresh air and freedom if they could manage the treacherous final climb. They emerged from the shaft into the storm-lashed canyon, just as their pursuers reached the bottom of the ventilation system. Silas had found their trail, and his voice echoed up from the depths with promises of violence and revenge. "The head frame," Dasan said urgently, pointing to the mine's main structure silhouetted against the lightning-torn sky. Rain streamed down his face as he calculated angles and distances. "If we can damage the support cables, we can seal the main shaft, trap them inside until help arrives." It was a desperate plan, but it was their only chance. Fighting their way through the wind and rain, they reached the wooden platform that supported the mine's lifting mechanism. The thick steel cables that raised and lowered the ore buckets were under tremendous tension, held in place by a complex system of pulleys and counterweights. "Stand back," Dasan warned, raising his rifle to shoot through the main support cable. But before he could fire, Silas Hartwell emerged from the ventilation shaft behind them, his face a mask of rain and desperation. The climb had cost him precious time and energy, but his determination to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes remained unshaken. "Stop!" He screamed over the thunder, his voice cracking with the strain of his impossible situation. "You don't understand what you're doing. That mine is my life's work." Clara turned to face the man, who had been like an uncle to her, the man who had murdered her father in a moment of tragic misunderstanding. "I understand, Uncle Silas," she said with heartbreaking dignity, her young voice carrying wisdom that should have been far beyond her years. "Papa loved you like a brother. He trusted you. And you killed him because you couldn't trust him back." Silas raised his rifle with trembling hands, but the sight of Clara's tear-stained face seemed to rob him of strength. In her eyes, he saw not just accusation, but something far worse, pity for what he had become, sorrow for what they had all lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though his words were lost in the storm. "God help me, I'm so sorry. But it's too late now. Too late for all of us." It was Beatrice who ended the standoff. As Silas hesitated, torn between desperation and remorse, she stepped forward and placed her hand on his rifle barrel. "It's over, Silas," she said with gentle firmness, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the thunder. "Henry's dead, but Clara's alive. Don't make this any worse than it already is." For a moment it seemed that sanity might prevail, that Silas would surrender and accept the consequences of his actions. His rifle lowered slightly, and something that might have been relief flickered in his desperate eyes. But then Conrad Morrison's voice cut through the storm as he and his men emerged from the main shaft, having fought their way up through the flooded workings. "Finish them!" Conrad snarled, his deputy's badge gleaming wetly in the lightning. "All of them. We can make it look like they died in a mine accident." The deputy's words shattered whatever remained of Silas's conscience. Faced with the reality of what he had become, a murderer and accomplice to further murders, something inside him finally broke completely. With a wordless cry of anguish that seemed to tear from the very depths of his soul, he turned his rifle on Conrad Morrison. "No more killing." Silas screamed over the storm's fury, his voice raw with emotion. "Henry's blood is on my hands. I won't have the child's too." The two men fired simultaneously, their muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like malevolent lightning. Conrad's bullet took Silas high in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the headframe support structure. But Silas's shot found its mark as well, and Conrad Morrison pitched backward into the flooded mine shaft with a scream that was cut short by the rushing water below. The impact of Silas's body against the headframe snapped the main support cable with a sound like thunder. The entire structure began to collapse, wooden beams and steel machinery crashing down into the mine opening with earth-shaking force. The Quicksilver mine, which had been the source of so much greed and violence, finally claimed its last victims as tons of timber and metal sealed its depths forever. "Run!" Dasan shouted, grabbing Clara and Beatrice as the ground began to give way beneath their feet. They sprinted away from the collapsing mine just as the cavalry patrol from Fort Huachuca crested the canyon rim, their blue uniforms and yellow neckerchiefs visible even through the driving rain. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the corrupt deputy, led his men down the treacherous slope with professional efficiency, their horses sure-footed despite the challenging terrain. "It's over," Dr. Henley said simply as he examined the wreckage of the Quicksilver mine. The frontier physician had arrived with the patrol, his medical bag ready, but finding little to tend except exhaustion and emotional trauma. The corruption ends here. In the aftermath of the storm, as the cavalry secured what remained of Silas's operation and began the process of territorial justice, Clara made one final discovery. Hidden in the innermost compartment of her father's locket, protected by oiled leather, and her mother's careful foresight, was a document that bore the seal of Swedish nobility, proof that Anna Lindqvist Eriksson had been the daughter of a count, and that Clara herself was heir to an aristocratic legacy worth far more than any silver mine. 6 months later, spring had returned to Arizona territory, bringing with it wildflowers that carpeted the desert floor in brilliant displays of color. Clara sat at the kitchen table of the house she now shared with Dasan and Beatrice, carefully working through her lessons in Swedish language and Apache traditions. The mining claim that her father had died protecting had been properly transferred to her name with Beatrice and Dasan, serving as trustees until Clara came of age. But the true value of her inheritance had proven to be far greater than anyone had imagined. Judge Harrison had arrived from Tucson with documents from Stockholm, genealogical charts, property deeds, investment records proving that Clara was the sole heir to the Lindqvist estate, including lands and holdings valued at over $300,000. "The choice is yours, Clara," he had said with the gravity befitting such a momentous decision. "You can claim your birthright and return to Sweden as Countess Lindqvist, or remain in America as Clara Eriksson." Clara studied the papers spread before her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. Castles and estates, ancient titles and modern investments, everything a child could dream of. But as she looked around the simple kitchen where she had spent the happiest months of her life, she realized her true treasures could not be measured in gold. "I want to understand my heritage," she said finally, her voice carrying the thoughtful consideration that had become her trademark. "I want to learn about my ancestors and honor their memory. But I also know where I belong. My home is here with the people who chose to love me, not because of my bloodline, but because of who I am inside." She used her inheritance wisely. A new school was built in Willow Springs, equipped with books and supplies that would serve generations of frontier children. A medical clinic was established with Dr. Henley as its director. Most importantly, Clara established a legal aid society dedicated to protecting orphan children and ensuring that no other family would suffer from territorial corruption. On a crisp evening in late autumn, Clara sat on the porch of her home with Dasan and Beatrice. The tin locket hung around her neck, no longer a mystery, but a bridge connecting her past with her chosen future. "Tell me again about Uncle Silas," she said quietly, as she had many times since learning the full truth about her father's death. Dasan's weathered face grew thoughtful as he considered his words carefully. "He was a good man who made a terrible mistake," he said finally. "Fear and wounded pride made him do something he could never undo. But in the end, he chose your life over his own freedom. That has to count for something. Do you think Papa would have forgiven him?" Clara asked, her voice carrying the weight of a question that had haunted her dreams. Beatrice reached over and took Clara's hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Your father loved Silas like a brother," she said softly. "I think he would have been heartbroken by what happened. But yes, I think he would have forgiven him. That's the kind of man Henry was." Clara nodded, understanding that forgiveness was sometimes more about healing the living than absolving the dead. She had learned that family was not just about blood, it was about the people who chose to stand by you when everything else fell apart. Dasan emerged from the house carrying the same wooden bowl and spoon that had sustained them during their first desperate night together. It had become a ritual between them, this simple sharing of food and warmth as each day ended. "Well done, Abini," he said in Apache, offering Clara the first spoonful of the evening meal. "Eat well, daughter of my heart." But Clara had learned the deeper meaning of family during their ordeal. She accepted the spoon, then turned to offer the first bite to Dasan instead. "We share everything now," she said with quiet authority, her words carrying the weight of everything they had endured together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Three voices joined together in quiet conversation about the day's events and tomorrow's plans. They were an unlikely family born from tragedy and forged in violence, but they were family nonetheless. The desert wind carried their voices across the high country past red cliffs and through endless expanses of sage and stone. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and moved closer to the warmth of her chosen family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between easy paths and right ones. But tonight, as embers from their fire danced upward toward the star-filled sky, she was exactly where she belonged, safe in the circle of love that had saved her life and given her a future worth living. The last words of the evening were spoken by Dasan in his native tongue, a blessing upon the house and all who dwelt within it. Clara didn't understand every Apache word, but she understood their meaning perfectly. Family, protection, love that endures beyond death itself. It was enough. It would always be enough.